It really is a huge pleasure to have John here. John is a man in great demand, so I'm glad he's been able to make it. And actually, the paradox in introducing John is there is so much you could say about him. You can actually say it very briefly. John, at one level, is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, but he probably is the UK's leading psephologist. Is that fair?
That's for others to judge, okay. Steve.
So he is the UK's leading psephologist. Now, normally, the interesting thing is in academia, there's often a negative correlation between media exposure and academic reputation. But I think in the case of John, the opposite is true. I mean, he is the UK's pollster. Even if you've never seen him before, you all know him because you've seen him so often. Out of the referendum, out of the frying pan, he's into the fire of the general election, and I'm sure we will see much more of him. Of course, behind that lies a whole series of other activities. I mean, John has been central in well, as it says here, the Scottish Centre for Social Research. He's been co-director of the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey and the British Social Attitudes Survey and the General Elections Survey. But as I say, go on and on and on. But the simple way of summing it up is he is the UK's leading pollster. Today he's going to talk to us about the findings relating to the independence referendum, head or heart. So as I say, thank you very much for coming, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Now, there is one important thing that you should know, that is what's often important about introductions is what's not said as opposed to what is said. And the crucial thing that Steve did not say, quite correctly did not say, I'm not a social psychologist. So those of you who are hoping for lots of deep references to the literature of social psychology, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. You will in any case get disappointed for a second reason, because one of the reasons why I accept this invitation is that I am in the midst of trying to write a book about the referendum and why voters voted as they did. But I'm not writing it for some renowned university press. I'm writing it for Ian Dale's Bite Back operation, and it does therefore need to be understood by the general public. So behind some of this, there is indeed a certain amount of statistical analysis, etc., which I'm quite happy to refer to. But for the most part, I'm going to go for the more popular form of trying to illustrate what I have to say. Okay. The first thing I think is just worth doing is just standing back, because in a sense, I mean, part of the question that I'm asking, you know, did people vote with their head or with their heart, is a kind of very, very standard one in social science. It's the kind of classic tournament that political scientists do, and particularly those of us who study elections do. We kind of always are having a tournament between social psychology, and it's all to do with affect, versus economics, it's all to do with rationality. At the moment, rationality tends to be in the more popular of the two explanations so far as voting behaviour is concerned. But that's essentially, you know, political science has very, very little in the way of its own domestically generated theory. It just lives off other social sciences. And certainly this question of whether or not voting behaviour is essentially the result of affect and emotion and people's sense of identity versus, in some sense or another, a rational calculation, and there are a variety of theories about rational calculation, is a standard argument. But then, so that's kind of, part of it is just a standard classic academic motivation of a very, very old question. But it's also, I would like you to kind of just stand back a little bit and just think about what was the somewhat curious nature of the referendum campaign that we actually had. Because, you know, one thing one has to say is that the referendum would not have happened if it were not true that Scotland is widely conceptualised as a nation. And that indeed, as I will go on to show, that indeed much of its population has a distinctive sense of identity which is not replicated in the rest of the UK. And that therefore, in a sense, the referendum was about a very standard political question is, well, who is us? Who is the nation? And do we want the nation to be reflected in the form of the state? Classic question of nationalism. And to that extent, therefore, you might presume that we would have a referendum which essentially primarily focused on whether or not Scotland wants to define itself as being a distinct nation or not, and whether or not, as a distinct nation, it did actually require to be a separate state. And there was some of that. The arguments, for example, that you shouldn't have those nasty Tories running anything north of the border because nobody votes for them north of the border, and this is a democratic outrage. Well, that was always an argument, and I kind of chaired quite a few debates during the referendum where the two sides just talked past each other. Because, of course, what the yes side was saying is it's undemocratic because the us, that we defined the us, viz. Scotland, didn't vote for them, whereas the people on the no side said there isn't a problem here because the us, as we define it, viz. Britain, voted for them. We may not like it, but that's it. And they just kind of literally talked past each other. But most of the referendum campaign, however, was not about that. Indeed, to a considerable degree by choice, much of the campaign, even on the yes side, was not about this. If you spoke to some of the relatively senior strategists in the yes campaign, they would say, no, we're not arguing this, for some essentialist reason that Scotland, it's a nation, it has to be a state, and that's all it's about. They would say, look, we're arguing this because we actually believe that Scotland will be governed more effectively, notice the word that effectively, if it can be an independent state. In other words, it was saying, hang on, life will be better. And indeed, in fact, most of the referendum campaign was not about who's us and who's them, at least not explicitly. It was rather about, will the economy be better or worse? Can we afford it? What are the implications of public spending? Can we create a more equal society or not? Will the NHS go down the tubes if we remain in the Union? What about, will there be any money to pay for pensions if Scotland is living off its own tax base? Etc., etc. It was primarily about, okay, will it be good news or bad news if Scotland remains in the Union or becomes an independent country? Now, unfortunately, what is now the Republic of Ireland, A, didn't have a referendum before it became independent, and B, we didn't have polling. And to that extent, at least, I'm now going to make some assertions for which there isn't any evidence. But I'm hoping that most of you will probably accept that there's a reasonable proposition, i.e., the truth is that probably if I were trying to write about, let's say, the Irish referendum of 1920, it would be a very short talk. That essentially Ireland, most people in Ireland were saying, we never want to be part of the United Kingdom. We were invaded by the English kings back in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. They should never have been here. We never want to be part of it. They imposed the United Kingdom Parliament on it. We just want out. And there wouldn't have been arguments about whether or not, if Ireland became an independent country, there would be another potato famine or not, or whether or not it would or would not suffer substantial levels of net outward migration because people would find working in London more attractive than continuing to work in Dublin. Essentially, the argument was, they're us, they are other, we are us, and we wish to assert ourselves. So, of course, different histories. Ireland, indeed, for the most part, was never successfully integrated in the United Kingdom. Scotland was, and therefore, in a sense, it makes it a much more fascinating case. Okay, so that's part of where I'm coming from, is, as it were, this question that's supposedly about nationalism and nation and the state and who is us and who is them, got into very much an argument about what would be the consequences. And in a sense, therefore, what I'm trying to ask is, well, was this elite preoccupation reflected in the decisions being made by voters? What am I using as evidence? I'm being Catholic in my use of evidence. No one source is adequate for this task. Arguably, the three sources together are not adequate to the task, but at least they get us rather close to what we need. Number one is a survey that Steve has already mentioned, Scottish Social Attitudes. This is an annual survey conducted by Scots in Social Research. It interviews roughly 1,500 people, and it's done for it's good old-fashioned, high-quality survey research. 1,500 people, probability sample, interviewed face-to-face in their own homes for about an hour or so. Fortunately, also, this is also quite actually very useful, not just about politics. We might ask them about abortion or about sectarianism or, what about the role of grandmothers in society, whatever kind of social research we're currently doing in that year. The great advantage of that, therefore, is that when interviewers are knocking on people's doors, they don't have to say, oh, by the way, I just want to bore you rigid for a 45-minute questionnaire about politics. I'm going to have something about grandparenting or about abortion or about religion, something that most people will be much more interested in, and they put up with the 10 or 15 minutes questions about politics along the way, which therefore improves the representative of the sample. So that's source number one, but it's an annual survey, and the last wave of it, so far as the referendum was concerned, was in the summer of 2014, so it's somewhat before the referendum. The second source I'm using is the internet panel that is being run on behalf of the British Election Study, which is the principal academic survey-based instrument for studying voting behaviour in the UK, which got boosted by the ESRC to also enable it to cover the referendum. Its principal focus is the general election this coming May. Here we come to the arguments about these things. The downside of it is definitely not a probability sample. It's those people who seemingly are daft enough to keep on filling in YouGov's forms for 50p a time. They're definitely more interested in politics than the average punter. But the great advantage is that you can get lots of these folk, and it's got about a 5,000 sample of people in Scotland. And they were interviewed, first of all, in February, again in May, just after the European elections, and then again after the referendum. So this enables me to take the story forward. And it also gives me a certain amount of panel data, which I'm going to exploit a little bit towards the end of this talk. The third thing, however, I'm also going to use are the opinion polls for all their strengths and weaknesses, because some of them at least, not least because in some cases I was able to put the questions on them, asked questions regularly over a month, so you therefore get kind of very regular readings of at least attempts to get point estimates of the distribution of public opinion. What I've tried to do on each of the slides is to tell what the source is, because it isn't the case that the first third of the talk is about one and the second third is about a third or whatever. There's a bit of that, but there's also about a certain amount of interleaving. But if you get lost, just put your hand up. Say, where the hell did that come from? Okay, the first couple of points, however, is just a little bit of a preamble, because this is something that I'm going to use, and therefore I thought I should probably at least tell you a little bit about it. For the most part, in most of my talk, my dependent variable, as it were, is going to be whether or not people said they voted yes or no. And I usually just go percentage yes. It's just just easier to talk about the yes side for some reason or another. But on some occasions, I'm also wanting to look at how the link between various attributes of an individual, be they their sense of identity or their instrumental evaluations, how that it developed not just simply during the course of the last 12 months or so, but over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. And to be able to do that, I have to use a different question to identify the supporters of independence. And the question I'm using is the question that Scottish Social Attitudes has been asking ever since 1999. In fact, it was first asked on the Scottish Election Study of 1997. It shows its age. It was crafted in the 1990s, when the SNP had not that long ago had a debate about whether or not it wanted independence inside or outside the European Union. Difficult to remember that one during the course of the referendum debate, that at one stage the SNP actually wanted to be independent outside the European Union, but anyway. And the second bit that's in here is the kind of Tony Blair legacy, which is, well, do you want a parliament that has taxation powers or not? But of course, that debate's long since flowed down lots of bridges. And for all practical arguments, I'm basically looking at these two groups combined. Okay, I'm not using the rest of it. But just to give you some idea, and also to give you an idea of the backdrop against this referendum is being fought. This is actually the long-term time series of that question, asked every year on Scottish Social Attitudes. And the truth is that in holding a referendum and trying to persuade Scotland of the case for independence, the yes side had taken on an enormous job. It wasn't the case, for example, that the election of the first election of a minority SNP government in 2007 was accompanied by a marked increase in support for independence, nor was it the case, as the SNP had anticipated, if they came to power and they actually did a reasonably good job, and most people in Scotland actually think they do a reasonably good job, that therefore as a result people would say, well, they clearly are wise and wonderful people, and we will now follow you into the promised land of independence. Now actually, if anything in recent years, in the run-up to the referendum, people were saying, somebody knows how to make the machinery work. Somebody is willing to stand up to London. That's exactly what we want out of devolution. So therefore, we don't need to leave the United Kingdom. Now, that said, as you can see, there is no doubt that during the course of the long referendum campaign, the SNP got support up. And this is in the summer of 2014. And again, it moved further beyond that. And so, although the yes side lost, it wasn't a surprise the yes side lost. If there was any... If anybody in London had thought there was any serious prospect of Scotland voting yes, they would not have allowed the referendum to have been held in the first place. And they would have allowed Lord Hope in the Supreme Court to have an argument with Alex Salmond as to whether or not the Scottish Parliament could hold a referendum off its own legal bat. So the point of the exercise was to demonstrate that Scotland wanted to stay in the Union. Against that backdrop, of course, the fact that the yes side ended up with 45% was quite a remarkable achievement, which is why most of us think, although they've lost the vote, and that was almost inevitable, they undoubtedly won the campaign. And kind of part of what I want to do with this is maybe to get a few clues as to why that happened. Okay, but that's really all just kind of backdrop. What about identity? Now, I'm afraid you'll find that political scientists on surveys, even sociologists on surveys, have to use relatively crude measures of identity. No chance to sit down with people and say, well, do you feel Scottish when you're in Hampden Park, but do you feel British when you're at Merrifield or whatever? I mean, the things that we all know that to some degree identity is a function of context. We have to ask a bold question, and the question is, which question is most useful? What I'm showing you here is a question that was first developed by actually Joan Lintz and popularized by Luis Moreno, both of them Spanish political scientists, because they were interested in the phenomenon of people actually having a dual sense of identity. So this is kind of coming back to the situation and beginning to tap into the fact that, of course, Scotland was indeed an integral part of and had been an integral part of the UK for 300 years and full participate in the British Empire and all the rest of it. Now, the Moreno question is very simple. It basically assumes that for most people, there are only two key relevant identities, at least so far as national identity is concerned. And you start with Scottish, not British, more Scottish than British, equally Scottish and British, more British than Scottish, British, not Scottish. And we've been asking that for many years. 2 points to make. The first is that if the referendum was simply about identity, you know what, Scotland would have probably voted yes, right? Pretty difficult to believe it would have done anything else. Because only around 10% of the population in Scotland actually says, I'm more British than I am Scottish. That said, however, what of course is also true is that a lot of people do acknowledge both. And that therefore, arguably for many people, answering the question, should Scotland be an independent country and therefore its rider, and therefore do you want to leave the United Kingdom, is not necessarily a particularly easy question to answer, given people's sense of identity. The third point to note, and this was something that kind of we sat on for quite a while because, not quite sure whether it's true or whatever, but notice that actually in recent years, the proportion of people who claim a exclusively Scottish identity has been a little bit lower. And probably the onset of the referendum, etc., did remind a few people in Scotland that actually somewhere other in the back drawer of their memory and their emotions, there was still a little bit of the Union Jack flying. And the proportion of people who claim not to be Scottish fell somewhat. Now, however, wonderful and popularised though that question is, well, yeah, sure. No, let's just go a little bit further. I'll come on to the other thing. Now, I've already suggested if Scotland were simply voting on the basis of identity, then it should be willing to vote yes. Well, actually, and this is using the question I was showing you earlier, because I'm looking over a longer time frame, actually, even those people who claim to be exclusively Scottish, before the referendum started at least, only about a half of them were saying, yeah, and I want Scotland to be independent. And the second thing to note is that the moment people begin to feel anything more than a modicum of Britishness, the idea of leaving the UK support for it begins to fall away quite dramatically. So it's very much an asymmetric contest in that way. Now that said, and this is something I will keep on referring to some degree, notice how, to some degree at least, though not dramatically in this instance, the link between people's attribute, in this case identity, and whether or not they're going to support independence begins to strengthen over time. And this is what we would expect referendum campaigns to do. Gradually people's opinions crystallise, gradually they package their views into views that are consistent with whichever direction they're going. And there's a little bit of this going on, but of that much more anon. Now, and indeed, probably during the course of the last weeks of the campaign, this process continued further. I'll give you some evidence towards the end, which also supports this. This is now just taking Ipsos Mori's polls. Ipsos Mori always asks the Moreno question. This is the evidence from the last two opinion polls. So this is literally the week of the referendum. And by this stage, the link between identity and vote preference had become rather stronger. However, just occasionally, I mean, academics often spend, many a year toiling away at the same thing and doing the same thing, and then all of a sudden somebody has a brainwave. And this, I have to admit, is a David McCrone brainwave. David said, well, and David was one of the people who got Luis Moreno to popularise his stuff within Scottish academia. But at some point, David said to us, you know what? Why don't we ask people separately how Scottish they feel and how British they feel? Why do we assume that people think of these as opposites? And in any case, particularly, why do we assume that if somebody feels strongly Scottish, they do not also feel strongly British, etc.? So we started to do that, and we fairly rapidly learned something rather important. So we now simply gave people a 7-point scale, but one end of which was, not Scottish stroke British at all, and on the right-hand side, very strongly Scottish to very strongly British. Now, what you then discover is that actually feeling Scottish is almost a ubiquitous quality in Scotland. Very few people deny that proposition. You've got something, you've got 2/3 of the Scottish population giving themselves a mark of at least 6 out of 7 when asked how Scottish they are, and there's hardly anybody down here. What divides this society is how British they feel. It's almost, it's kind of social science, quantitative social scientist dream, it's almost evenly distributed across the 7 points of the spectrum. And that only 22% of people say they're strongly British, and equally there are 20-odd% on the bottom end. So a crucial point, therefore, one is that, of course, is that if indeed we are talking about something that divides a society, which independence does, it's kind of actually going to be much more likely that it's this that matters rather than this, because actually statistically it's got a much better chance of discriminating between yes and no. And this is what we're going to show in a moment. But the other thing that this is also then confirmed by, this is now the same exercise being done using a somewhat different question using the Internet Panel Survey. And that the picture becomes even starker. So this is done in September of this year. People were simply they were given a very similar 7-point scale, how Scottish, how British do you feel? Now at this point, 62% of people put themselves in the far right-hand side. Only 27% said they were strongly British. Now actually what you then discover about this group is that actually about a quarter of them are in here. There's about a quarter of that 62% who also say I'm strongly British. There's then another quarter who are down here. So this group of people who feel very strongly Scottish are a combination of people who feel their sense of identity strongly, irrespective of what that identity is, and they feel both strongly Scottish and strongly British, and another set of people who feel strongly Scottish and deny that they are British. But that therefore, this is one of the ways in which therefore Scottishness is ubiquitous, it unites us as a society, it's the Britishness that divides us. And that therefore, fascinatingly, although the question on the ballot paper was, is Scotland an independent, should Scotland be an independent country? Arguably the question, at least so far as affect is concerned, that people were asking themselves is, do I want to leave the UK? Am I not British anymore? The latent question was arguably the more important one. And here you can see very clearly how this emerges. This is now just simply looking this is 2004 Scottish Society's level of support for independence, broken down by where people lie on the Scottish and the British end of the spectrum. And notice, even amongst those people who say they are very strongly Scottish, only 30% of people at that stage were supporting independence. It's not that good a discriminator. How British you feel, however, it's almost a straight line here if you were to put the linear regression in. So it's the sense of British identity that's crucial, rather than the sense of Scottish identity. It's the latent question, not the manifest question, that appeared to be crucial. So far, affect is concerned. And most of what I'm going to do in the rest of this, so far as affect is concerned, primarily focuses on this sense of British identity. Not always, but most of it. Okay, so that's my raw material so far as identity is concerned. What about, do people think of the instrumental consequences, and what can we learn about that? So I'm kind of going to talk about the period up to the referendum, and then I will talk about what actually happened in the referendum itself. One of the things that we've been doing on Scottish Societies for quite a while is simply saying to people, if Scotland becomes an independent country, do you think the economy is going to get better or worse? Do you think the gap between rich and poor is going to get bigger or smaller? Do you think that Scotland's voice in the world will get stronger or weaker, etc.? Partly inspired, in fact, by some questions that we asked of devolution back in 1997. One of the things that we discovered about devolution in 1997 was that it was widely regarded as about to introduce a land of milk and honey. Everybody thought that Scotland's voice in the UK would be strengthened, the educational system would get better, the health service would get better. It was going to be wonderful. It's never been the case that the vast bulk of people in Scotland thought that independence was going to be wonderful. Now, some things people thought would be better, assuming you regard it as being better. So one question was, will people have more or less pride in their country? Half people said, yeah, we would have more pride in ourselves if we were to be independent. Will we have a stronger or weaker voice in the world? Well, we started off thinking that might be the case, so we weren't quite so clear towards the end of the referendum. Would the economy be better or worse? Well, we were often just divided kind of a third on this issue. Would inequality become greater or less? Well, actually, on the measure that we had on SSA, though I'll show you some others later on, we weren't terribly convinced of that argument either. And then, would we be able to bail out the banks? Well, we weren't quite sure about that. So certainly the balance of opinion on a lot of these instrumental measures didn't look that favourable to the yes side, and evidently would begin to be a potential counterpoint to the fact that this is a predominantly Scottish society. Another measure we have, which is one that we happen to have over quite a nice long period of time, and it kind of helps to further illustrate a point I was making earlier, is simply the old question of the Barnett formula, but turned into human form. So do you think that Scotland gets more or less than its fair share of public spending, or is it pretty much right? Back in the early years of devolution, we still thought we was being robbed. Gradually, there's a growing appreciation that maybe we aren't quite being robbed, and the proportion of people who think that we got less than a fair share fell. Notice in particular, at roughly the time that Alex Salmond first became First Minister, and it's quite bounced along since then. But there's still a substantial minority of people who think that we do badly out of the Union, but equally, however, others who think not so badly. So on all these instrumental evaluations, things don't necessarily look that brilliant for the yes side. But do they matter? Did any of this actually make a difference to people or not? Well, here's the kind of quasi-academic answer, and then I'll kind of illustrate some of this material. this is just simply doing a cross-sectional logistic regression analysis. So the dependent variables, whether you support independence or not. We have a whole bunch of independent variables, most of the key ones of which I've already introduced you to, though there are a few others that I don't want to spend time talking about this afternoon. It's simply very simple using a stepwise procedure, and what I'm showing you here is simply the order in which, using a stepwise procedure, the various items get introduced into the equation. And what I want you to note, first of all, is it's the economy stupid, it's the economy stupid, and actually if I went back to 2012, it was also the economy stupid. So one instrumental evaluation consistently, from the very early days of the referendum campaign, was emerging as apparently the single strongest bivariate relationship. There are a few other things. Scotland's voice in the world has tended to appear as being relatively important. The inequality argument wasn't very prominent in 2013. It made some progress by 2014, more of that later on. And then and only then do we get to people's sense of national identity. And it doesn't matter whether you use Moreno or whether you use the British scale, you get pretty much the same answer. And then there are a few other things here which I won't bother to go into, which are kind of relatively marginal additions to R squared. So apparently, seemingly on the basis of this indeed, yes, identity mattered. There were some people out there who were seemingly willing to vote yes, or equally willing to vote no, even though they weren't necessarily sure that independence would be a good thing for Scotland instrumentally, or conversely, that staying in the Union would necessarily be a good thing for Scotland. For them, it was a question of heart, and that was it, even if they otherwise had doubts. But evidently for many others, it was also had to be bolstered by a sense that actually it would work out in practice. Now let me illustrate some of this with just simply showing some of the bivariate relationships. And it also shows you how some of the ways the thing developed during the course of the campaign. So this is the economy question. It simply says to people, do you think the economy is going to be a lot better, a lot worse, etc., etc. And as you can see, got a very clear relationship. Around 90% of people who thought the economy would be a lot better were backing independence. They were saying they're going to vote yes. And conversely, if you thought it really wasn't going to be a terribly good idea, you definitely weren't going to vote for it. This is kind of almost a perfect relationship. Two other points to note, however. Notice number one, and it's something I've already kind of pointed out with identity. If you kind of, it might be all right. Mind you, not quite sure. It just depends. But in any case, there'll still be politicians running the show, so maybe it won't make that much difference. You still were inclined to stick with no. 39% yes. Second thing you will note, however, is that indeed the relationship strengthened during the course. So this is 2013, this is 2014. So the campaign here does really begin to some degree to crystallise people's views, particularly for this group here. All right? The folk who thought, well, it won't be milk and honey, but actually I think it will be a bit better. They, during the course of the referendum campaign, seemingly became increasingly willing to get on side. Very similar story to another instrumental evaluation. Do you think Scotland's voice will be stronger or weaker in the world? It isn't quite a stronger relationship, as you can see, but the relationship got stronger during the course of time. But again, if you simply thought it's not going to make any difference, you're inclined to stick with the Union. The debate about inequality, which was one of the three principal strands in the Scottish Government's White Paper, as I've already suggested earlier on in the referendum, and this is going back to 2012, actually, better here, by the way, just for the purpose of elaboration, means a smaller gap, right? We're accepting the values of the SNP with respect to equality here. That's not necessarily a value judgment on my part. I'm just simply accepting their value judgments. So, but even if you thought back in 2012 that actually independence would bring about a more equal society, you're only 50% likely to be an independent supporter. Now that did grow during the referendum, and you can see again, particularly here, how opinion begins to polarize. But again, of course, it's here. The people in the middle don't necessarily going with it. So this did begin to come to matter more, and which is why, therefore, to some degree, comes up the list of propositions that seem to matter. In contrast, and kind of showing the asymmetric nature of the debate, what you thought about the union, and this is a different question from the other one I showed, this is a question about whose economy do you think benefits from the union. You know, this matters, but you know, it never really got to matter much more than it always ever had done. So the other point, therefore, to note, and I'll talk about this a bit more later on, it is so although on the one hand, the latent question people were asking themselves seemed to be, am I still British? Do I want to leave the United Kingdom? Insofar as they then couldn't answer that, were then looking for answers to that question, it seemed to be, well, I'm only willing to let go of it if I think that independence will be better, and it's not however central to people's view as to, well, is the union okay as it is? They are not working terribly well. If they simply thought the union wasn't working terribly well, but weren't convinced that independence would be any better, they were unlikely to be willing to jump. So to be persuaded to leave aside their Britishness, it looks as though people actually need to be convinced that independence was going to be a good idea. Okay. Now that's the position basically up to the summer, but what about the actual vote at the end? Now here I'm switching to using primarily the British Election Study panel data set. And again, for time being at least, I'll show you a bit of panel analysis in a moment. I'm using it as a cross-section. This survey, it did a few things. So my dependent variable here is literally how people reported voting in the referendum. Some of the questions I'm using are questions that were last asked in the May wave, the wave 2 wave. That's the last time when this panel asked people, do you think independence will make Scotland's economy better or worse? It's a different structure. What they actually asked people, they gave people a proposition. If Scotland becomes independent, its economy will be worse. Do you think this is how likely or unlikely do you think this is going to be the case? So it's a somewhat different structure, which in a sense, from my point of view, in some senses is quite nice because it gives me the chance to see whether or not I do or don't get the same findings with different question wording. But it was only last asked in May. Now that does therefore mean, however, I am in this instance using data collected in May to predict behaviour in September. So for those of you whose head has been buzzing around for the last 15 minutes, hang on, what about reciprocal causation? I am gradually moving to beginning to deal with some of your potential concerns. So this is data collected in May. This is data collected in May. On the other hand, what they then asked people in September after the referendum was the equivalent question about the union. I think the rationale was, well, Scotland's now in the union, so let's ask people what they think of what's going to happen as a result of that. So it simply said to people, now that Scotland's in the union, its economy is going to get worse. How likely or unlikely is this to be the case? So that does therefore mean that we also have evaluations of the union as well as evaluations of the economy of independence, but albeit this is something that was gathered in September after the vote rather than beforehand. This is the Britishness scale, as I've already shown you earlier, also operationalised on BES. And there's also a question on Scotland's share of funding. This is about the union. So basically, I've got available to me on this panel survey a series of questions which are either very almost identical or are functionally equivalent to the questions on Scottish social attitudes. And I'm now using that and a variety of other variables, and they're not on here because they prove not to be statistically significant, to now I look at, in terms of a cross-sectional analysis, who's voting yes and who's voting no. And so yes, you've got it. Different survey, even with the fact that the data on the economy is collected at wave 2, whereas at the moment at least I'm using national identity at wave 3, it's still the economy that is somewhat more important. This is pretty important, but this is even more important. Second thing you will note is, again, building on the remarks I've just made, is that although people's perceptions of the union, and indeed it's the economy again, stupid, do matter, they're not as powerful, even though these are actually asked in the same wave as the yes vote, as people's evaluations of independence. So it's the independence argument that's more important than the argument about what the union does or doesn't achieve. So let me illustrate for this, and you can kind of begin to see a set of graphs that begin to look rather familiar. So this is why the Britishness variable is key, and you'll now see some really, really strong relationships. Amongst those people who said, I am not British, as of September of last year, 95% of them are yes voters. Conversely, only 10% here. Contrast, however, the Scottishness thing still is not so crucial. The folk here, of whom there are quite a lot, as you saw, are majority yes voters, but there's still nothing like this group here. And as soon as it tails away, there's not much doing. So again, confirmation that insofar as identity does matter, and it does matter to some degree, it's Britishness that mattered. It's whether or not people wish to remain in the UK, not their feelings of wishing to assert their sense of Scottish identity. This is why the economic perceptions become important. So these are whether or not, first of all, people thought that it was unlikely that independence would result in Scotland's economy getting worse. If you thought that was unlikely, you were virtually certain to be a yes voter, and conversely, at the other end of the spectrum, you were almost certain to be a no voter. And you can see, however, that while also people's views of the Union are clearly related, it's a somewhat weaker relationship. Not dramatically so, but somewhat weaker relationship. That's why the analysis is coming out as it is. The other perceptions of independence, well, there's a question in there about whether or not people think they'll be personally better off, which is kind of similar to the economy question, and that also is clearly related. And then notice how the argument about inequality, although yes, it's related, gradually, you start to politicise this issue, but it never ever had the clear relationship with supporting yes that the economic argument did. So that third strand of the yes campaign never had quite the same pulling power that the economic strand actually had. Okay, now, one of the other things, however, that one could say about all of this is, well, okay, it's fine to ask people whether or not they think the economy is going to be better or worse under independence. But arguably, fairly rapidly, the answer to that question is, who knows? Who can tell? And of course, one of the constant refrains in the referendum was, we don't have enough information. Would somebody please tell us the facts? And gradually you had to say to people, you know what, there are no facts. There are extrapolations, usually done by economists and therefore should be treated with caution, like all extrapolations by economists. Equally, of course, what was also true as a result of that is that much of what the no side was saying was, well, nobody really quite, for example, if you read any of the UK government's white papers, they followed a fairly standard structure, and the structure was, well, you know what, there's a few awkward questions here. What's going to happen as a result of independence to the price of bread or the price of a postage stamp or whatever? And you know what? We think we've identified some of the crucial things that do or do not have to be done in order to find out what the answer to that question would be. But you know also what? We're not going to tell you what we think should be done, because we want you to realise that independence is a project that's launched on the ship uncertainty, and we suspect that if you think that it's all a slightly uncertain, dubious project, you'll wish to hang on to nurse for fear of something worse. So therefore, one of the things therefore one's trying to do, and it's not that easy to do, what we're trying to get this sense of which, do people sense that it's a rather uncertain project, maybe even a somewhat risky project, is something that drew them back, even if they were kind of inclined to think that maybe actually Scotland would be better off. So how much does people's sense of being sure or unsure matters? And the answer to that is it looked as though it did make a difference, and it matters to people, and it mattered in a way that was disadvantageous to the yes side. So what I've done here, this in a sense is just illustrating an interaction term and a regression. So what I'm showing you here is that amongst those people who said, in an entirely separate question, right, this is not, they weren't asked how sure are you about the economic cost of independence, they were asked more broadly elsewhere in the survey, how sure are you about what would happen to Scotland if it were to become an independent country, just without reference to anything in particular. And amongst those people who said they were sure, the relationship between people's perceptions of the economy and whether they're going to vote yes or not is clearly very strong. Amongst those who went on and said, well, I'm not sure about all of this, you can see the relationship is rather weaker. In other words, on this left-hand side, the yes territory, that sense of uncertainty begins to get people to draw back from the idea of actually voting yes. Okay. Now, I've so far showed you a bunch of relationships in good academic fashion, but at some point it's kind of nice to say, well, hang on, but what's the distribution of these things? I gave you a little bit of an idea earlier about some of these things. One of the nice things about all this is, in fact, again, as Roy said, different measures, different survey, but actually we end up with quite similar results. So actually back in May, SSA was saying that more people thought the economy was going to be worse than going to be better. So also was the BES measure. We were saying that inequality, that argument hasn't really taken off. The BES was rather more circumspect, but was still not miles away. And again, how many people are certain? Only a third of people were sure, 2/3 were unsure. So that sense of uncertainty was there very clearly in both surveys and was there to a very similar extent. So that's, therefore, again, different analysis, different surveys, very similar marginals, very similar patterns of association. Okay, but what's happening to the point estimates over time? And this is where the opinion polls become useful. Basically, I've kind of argued so far, the economy mattered. It looks as though people were reluctant to vote yes if they weren't convinced that the economic consequences of independence would be favourable to Scotland. One of the things that ICM did for the Scotsman literally every month throughout 2014, with a reading first of all back in September, was to ask people, in itself it's not the world's most brilliant question, it only works because of the material that's around it. But people were saying, if Scotland became an independent country, do you think it would be good or bad for Scotland's economy? Very bold, very direct, very journalistic. But what I invite you to notice is that this group here, the people who thought it was going to be bad, always outnumbered the proportion who thought it would be good. The yes side made progress. They made progress in the winter when the yes campaign made an advance. And they also made progress in the last 4 weeks of the referendum, which is when we also know the yes side made progress. So one can see how the marginals shifted in the yes side's favour at the same time as they were shifting on the economy. But they never, ever got themselves into a position where a plurality of people in Scotland were saying, yeah, it's going to work. That's also true using a different measure that was done by YouGov. YouGov asked people whether or not Scotland would be better off or worse off if it became an independent country. Now, this doesn't have such a long time period. It particularly focuses on towards the end of the campaign from the summer onwards. Quite a dramatic movement. This, as you might have guessed it, is the now somewhat infamous YouGov poll, at least infamous in the eyes of some no campaigners, that put yes on 51% and no on 49%. But for the academics amongst us, the fascinating thing about was is that during this period, YouGov had a whole sequence of polls that gradually got the yes vote higher and higher, and it was underlain by exactly the kind of movement on people's attitudes towards the economy that you would expect to happen. And then it fell away again, which is probably one of the reasons why the yes vote again fell away a bit towards the end of the campaign. Now, but then the crucial point, however, to note is that even here, you hadn't managed to convince a plurality of people, although it's getting pretty close, that the economy is going to be better off. So progress made, but not enough. So throughout the campaign, on this crucial issue of whether or not Scotland's economy is going to be better or going to be worse, the yes side doesn't make enough progress. Now, on the other hand, I've already kind of suggested on inequality in a variety of ways, it did make progress. It made progress in politicising an issue that 2 years before the referendum didn't seem to matter a great deal to many voters. It's also the case here again is ICM again. They tracked people's views of this over time, and this got an even more favourable balance of opinion for the yes side than either the BES or SSA. But the crucial point is, here's the dynamic, that more people were convinced over time that actually Scotland as an independent country would be less, there would be less inequality. But as you've already seen, great stuff, but this isn't something that seems to be central to driving the vote. So you're winning an argument on an aspect of the debate that doesn't seem to matter as much to voters as the one on which you are not managing to win the debate for most part. So far as risk is concerned, again, we've got some evidence from the opinion polls, and indeed, this was a very, very simple journalistic attempt, but it kind of illustrates the point quite nicely. People were simply being asked by ICM, do you think that if Scotland becomes an independent country, it will be a huge risk or no risk at all, with a 5-point scale? If Scotland remains in the Union, would this be a huge risk or not a risk at all? So you're looking at people's perceptions of both. And as you can see, people were far more likely to regard independence as a risk than was staying in the Union. That's what the no side were relying on. And indeed, 30% of people didn't think there was any risk of staying inside the Union at all. Indeed, what you also discover if you kind of look underneath this, and this is also backed by some of the work that David Bell has done, is that actually even supporters of independence, not many of them gave that answer. Most of them were kind of here or here. Very few of them gave this answer. Quite a lot of them were along here. They kind of say, it's a bit of a risk. And then what you also discover, if you ask people separately questions designed to get their willingness to take risks, supporters of yes were rather more inclined to take risks on wider psychological measures. So risk was always an issue, and in part it was a question of people's appetite for it. But certainly what's also true again, during the last months of the campaign, the yes side did not succeed in making progress in reducing people's perceptions that it was a risky enterprise. This is the measure in June. This was the measure in September, literally, about a week before the referendum. And as you can see, if anything, people were even slightly more inclined to think that independence was a risk by the end of the whole campaign process than they had been a few months earlier. So again, equally on this crucial aspect, they didn't make much progress either. Now, one final point. As I said, everything I've done so far, cross-sectional analysis, beginning to address a little bit of reciprocal causation insofar as some of my measures were gathered at time t1 and they're used to predict a phenomenon at time t2, but I'm sure many of you are still going, yes, well, So I thought for the skeptics I would do something slightly more kosher. Very standard thing. What I've done here, this is again illustrating the results of a regression analysis, is of course what I've got, because I've got a panel survey, I've got what people said they were going to do. In this case, I've chosen May. I could have gone back to February. What people said they were going to do in May. What they said they ended up doing in September. I've also got their views about independence in May. I've also got how British they felt in May, so I'm now using the May measure of Britishness. So I can take those measures in May and look to see how well are these correlated with whether or not people shifted between May and September. The panel picks up everything that's there in the referendum campaign. There's essentially about a 5% increase in the net proportion saying they're going to vote yes in September as compared with May. So I've therefore focused, for the purpose of illustration, on the yes voters. So I've simply just taken the yes voters and then looked, doing logit analysis to see what things help to predict who switched to yes amongst this group by September. And you've guessed the answer. I only did this morning. I went, God, if this doesn't work, I'll be in trouble. But actually, yes, it's the economy stupid again. And I also know that somebody who's done the analysis for February, May came up with exactly the same answer between ways 1 and 2. If you thought that it was unlikely that the economy would be made worse by independence in May, and you said you were going to vote no, there's basically a 1 in 4 chance that by September you'd changed your mind and you'd switched to the yes side. In contrast, if you had been of the view that it wasn't a terribly good idea in May, you were very, very unlikely to switch sides. Now, it's not true to say that Britishness didn't matter either. It also does. You do the district regression, it also comes in as significant. It's just not as powerful as the head argument. But as you can see, amongst those people who were no voters, whose Britishness score on my 1 to 7 scale is 3 or less, I've put them together because otherwise there aren't enough of them, there's a 1 in 5 chance of your having switched sides by September. So again, for some people, in the end, their weak sense of British identity begins to tell, and it also helps to drive them into the S camp. But as you can see, it's just not as strong a relationship as it is in the case of the economy. So again, if you begin to do panel analysis, you begin to start to look at the dynamics of individual decisions during the campaign. The message that you get from the cross-sectional analysis, with all its potential limitations, is, however, confirmed. Okay, so what do I make of it all? Well, of course, the broad answer to the first question, head or heart, is the usual academic one. Well, of course, it's a bit of both. Of course it is. But certainly, given we were talking about a country where there is a widespread sense of dual identity, it wasn't likely that it was ever going to answer the referendum question on the basis of identity alone. But the fascinating thing about it is that actually, insofar as it was partly about identity, it wasn't about how Scottish people were. It was how British they felt. And this was a referendum about whether or not this place still felt part of Britain, rather than whether it was necessarily a place that has a distinct sense of its own nationhood. But for any of that to be translated into a yes vote, it had to be aligned with a favourable view of the instrumental consequences of independence, and above all, had to be aligned with a favourable view of the economic consequences of independence. And to that extent, at least, it was a question of the economy suited. It was an issue on which the yes side did make some progress, but probably not as much progress as they did on the inequality issue. But alas for them, the inequality issue was never as central in voters' minds as a reason to vote yes or no, as was the question of the economic consequences. And on the economic consequences, the yes side could never make enough progress to put people into the yes camp. Which I suppose then brings us back to the conversation that Steve and I were having just before we started, and he was kind of expressing the view that well, maybe this country will eventually become independent. And in a sense, you could interpret what I'm saying as, well, yeah, if at some point you can convince a majority of people in Scotland that actually it'll work, given their sense of nationhood, then it may well indeed be that this country will indeed at some point vote in favour of independence. $64,000 question, of course, is whether or not you'll ever succeed in persuading a majority of people in this country that it can be made to work or not. And I guess, therefore, to some degree at least, the future lies in the hands of the relative strength of the Scottish economy as compared with that of the UK. A story which, at least since the referendum, has continued to be a somewhat interesting one, given the state of the oil price. And on that point, I will conclude.
Good. Well, nothing controversial there at all. Questions?
Has anyone done any survey amongst residents of England about whether they feel more British or more English?
Oh, yes. Done plenty of that. Okay. The long-term data for, if you ask the Moreno, unfortunately we haven't done the separate scales. I mean, we ought to at some point if we can ever persuade somebody to give us the money to do it. But asking the Moreno question south of the border, are you British or do you feel English? What you discover is that, lots of people say they're equal. If you force people to choose an identity, you'll get slightly more saying they're British than saying they are English. And there's no great trend over time. What is true is that it looks as though when Scotland first got its own devolved parliament back in 1999, there was something of a re-arousal of Englishness, and the proportion of people who said they were English rather than British rose, and that has kind of remained constant over time. But it's still rather more saying that they are British. So that's terms of the margins. So that's kind of one thing behind your question. I think the second thing, I'll then send two other things which kind of perhaps feed off it. One is that insofar as there is an English National Party, it is currently UKIP. I happen at the moment to be writing about UKIP rather than writing about immediately about the referendum. And those people who have a sense of English identity are twice as likely to be UKIP supporters as those who have a sense of British identity. So identity is also part of the whole thing that's going on with UKIP. The second thing I would say to you, though, getting south of the border, is that the referendum campaign probably had more impact in England than it did in Scotland. I mean, I've said, there was some movement, TS, non-trivial. But if you kind of go back to some of the survey data for England for, let's say, 2011, early 2012, very often the answer you got back from the questions was, yeah, well, I suppose if they want to go off and do their own thing, that's fine. There's no skin off our nose, that's fine, And you'd often get something like a 50-50 attitude, where asking people directly, should Scotland become independent or not? By the end of the referendum campaign, people in England said, we'll be worse off if Scotland leaves, and we definitely don't want them to go. So I think there's no doubt that the referendum campaign persuaded many people in England, they might be pesky people, but we need them because it's in our own self-interest to hang on to them. And equally, I mean, the whole argument about the currency, for example, had far more impact south of the border. At one stage, people south of the border asked, should Scotland have its own, well, if they want to have its own currency, that's fine, there's no skin off our nose. If they want to keep the pound, that's fine. They want them to keep the pound by the end. So public opinion in England was much less strongly formed on the issue, was much more open to persuasion, and was definitely persuaded of the merits from their perspective of keeping Scotland inside the Union.
I should say that John has been very modest in various ways and is not publicising various other things he does. I mean, he curates the What Scotland Thinks website, and if you want the answer to virtually any question, get in on that.
Just in case where these slightly different graphs were coming from, these are downloaded straight from the website. So for those of you who've got to do a quick presentation on the referendum for a class of the students here, you can go to my website, you can download these as JPEG files and shove them into your presentation. Bingo.
And fine as regards Turkey. There was a question. Yeah.
Well, just put the source in the bottom.
I was just going to invite you to speculate on the basis of no data at all. If the referendum question had been framed the other way around, you know what I'm going to ask?
Yeah.
So the yes campaign had been the Unionist campaign. Do you think it would have made a difference?
No.
I will actually quote a bit of evidence in support of that proposition. Essentially, I would take the view that, look, I mean, this is a subject that this country's been arguing about for 40 years, ever since the first initial discovery of oil in the late 60s and the first success of the SNP in the early 1970s. This country has been debating its constitutional future. And when the Electoral Commission were testing the question that the government proposed, which at that time was, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? Well, anybody could have told ministers, and somebody should have told ministers, they won't agree to that. They've tried do you agree before, they tried it for the Welsh referendum, people think that's leading. Just put should in front, it'll be fine, which is what the Commission did. But what the Commission also then said, gosh almighty, you know what? We've road tested whether or not people want the alternative vote. We've road tested whether or not people want a regional assembly in the northeast of England. We've road tested whether or not people want a referendum, whether people want the Welsh Assembly to have full legislative powers. And in all those qualitative tests of the question, it really was like trying to stir mud. People didn't know what the hell we were talking about, etc., etc. And then when they reported on the focus groups that they did to road test the referendum question, they said, God, people know what you're talking about instantly, absolutely no. And so their view was that, because there were some people saying, it shouldn't be an independent country, it should be an independent state. I mean, they were all political scientists, who just. And the truth is, everybody knew what you were talking about. So I think the truth is, it didn't make any difference because people knew that what the proposition was about. It was whether or not this country was going to leave the UK or not.
I'll stop the front and go back. So, Andy, Fergus.
Nicola Sturgeon was recently talking about the conditions the SNP would put forward to support another party if necessary as well after the next election.
Yes.
And the report I heard, she mentioned two things.
Yes.
One was Trident,
Yes.
not reviewing Trident. I can't remember what the other one was.
The end of austerity.
Yeah, that's it. You've not mentioned Trident at all.
No.
I just wondered if you've got that multiple regression of into teams, the number of factors there. Was Trident one that was looked at, but people didn't care?
Yeah.
So the SNP, in that respect, are talking about something that people don't, isn't that important to people.
Yes and no is the answer to you, sir. You're quite right. This regression here, Trident could have been included, but it wasn't. It didn't make it because it was, once you put a bunch of other things in, right, it doesn't add to the variance. Okay. No, I mean Trident is a fascinating one. One of the, I mean, there are all sorts of eddies and currents in this one. We actually asked two questions about Trident. One was, do you think that Britain should basically have nuclear weapons? So that was about the principle, all right? And what we found, and this is consistent with other evidence, you've got basically a plurality of people in Scotland, but it's only a plurality who don't think the UK should be a nuclear weapons country. But it's about kind of 45-37, something like that, okay? So it's a little bit on the SNP side, but nothing like as much as the SNP would like to think. Ask the same question south of the border, it basically flips around. So England is plurality in favour, but the truth is both countries are very heavily divided on this issue. That was number one. We then asked a second question, and we asked it on both sides of the border. And this really did get the CND folk really upset because they didn't quite understand what was going on. We also then said to people, so if Scotland becomes an independent country, should the UK be allowed to keep its nuclear weapons on the River Clyde? All right, it's obviously a crucial issue in the referendum. And we actually found a modest, I mean very modest, but a modest plurality of people in Scotland saying yes. South of the border, they said, you must be joking. If those guys become independent, we want our weapons back, thank you very much. And of course, the folk in the CND camp went, oh, this can't possibly be true. You are saying that people in England are more anti-nuclear weapons than our lot? No, of course, that's not what we're saying, guys. What we're saying is that actually people south of the border don't trust you to hang on to them. They want them back, please, thank you very much, if you decide to become independent. So all those possibilities there. So I mean, there is a relationship. Now that said, there is then something, that doesn't mean to say that, yes, views on Trident are related to independence. It's just they don't add to your ability to explain things. What, however, is then also now true about the current situation is that it is the case that a majority of SNP supporters are anti-Trident, and it's now the case that a majority of Labour supporters are pro-Trident. So Jim Murphy is in good territory so far as the 25% he's got. His problem is, which he appreciates, is that the folk he wants trying to get back, however, on the other side of the fence. But anyway, you're tempting me to get into the whole question of post-May the 7th negotiations, and I should avoid that temptation.
I was wondering if I could ask you about your argument that people voted on the basis of economy rather than identity.
More on one than the other.
More on identity. The way you framed identity is very much in terms of national identity.
Yes.
So I guess, first of all, well, you can speak a little bit about different forms of identity, for example, class identity.
Yes.
So if you look at Dundee and Glasgow, which you said, yes, they voted, they got the working class. The other thing I was going to say is, if you look at your economy question, I think paraphrasing, it said something like, in the Scottish independence referendum, will the Scottish economy be better? Well, that's a question riddled with identity, riddled with national identity. So, to what extent do you think the economy question is actually underpinned by that sense of national identity? Because it's not necessarily saying, am I going to have personally more money in my pocket? It's, will the economy of Scotland be better? Whatever better means, it might be more equal or more wealth.
Okay, I'll come back. What was your first question again? So I'll come back to the second one. Yeah, okay, yeah. The reason my class isn't there is we asked it and it didn't make any difference, right? We asked people the very standard Butler and Stokes subjective class identity question. It goes back to the 1960s, right? Of course, one of the other fascinating things about the referendum here and identity, and about particularly cultural markers of identity, is, of course, we are talking about a society that, for the most part, doesn't have its own language. Though one thing that Lindsay Patterson, who was working with us, did discover, and this really is absolutely the margin. At the margin, those people who were keener on seeing more people speak Gaelic we're rather more likely to be yes supporters after you control for a bunch of other things. But it's very, very much at the margin. So that's the thing. Now, the second thing, right, we're back to the questions of reciprocal causation and people to distinguish, etc., etc. One of the things that we have done, being very well aware of this, we've done lots of things like, well, let's first of all regress economy against national identity and only then take the residuals from that and only then plug it into an equation. We've done lots of that kind of stuff. You still get the same answer, all right? Which is why I kind of didn't bother to bore you with it all. None of these things are perfect, and at the end of the day, to some degree, my reaction to these things is, well, of course, in asking the question, is it head or heart, it's a very academic question, and most people can't compartmentalize themselves in that sense. But the truth is, insofar as one can unpack it, this is still what comes up. But just to clarify, I'm not saying that it isn't. It isn't about identity. It is partly about identity. And in part, identity, the questions would not be being posed without the sense of identity being there. But them going on to say, however, that the answer to the question does seem to depend on instrumentality. And if the sense that is going to be instrumentally beneficial isn't in place, you're unlikely to give a positive answer to the question, even if your sense of identity might push you in one particular direction or another.
Kieran. So in the midst of all of this, it felt very much like social media was playing a big role, or at least from the perspective of curating your own social media bubble, it felt like there was some sort of galvanization of whatever it was that you felt personally. Is there any evidence that it did change the rules for elections, or that it helped one side more than another?
There's plenty of evidence that yes supporters were more active on social media than no supporters. My colleague Mark Shepherd ran a project in which he was tracking the retweets and Facebook likes and dislikes, etc., during the referendum campaign. And throughout, yes supporters were well ahead of no supporters, and if anything, the gap tended to increase. So if you look at that, it's kind of clear that the yes side was more active. But then what you then also do is you realise that what it was, I forgot, I may get the exact figures wrong, but the orders of things are right. About 10% of people used social media to follow the referendum campaign. And whatever it is, 60% of people watched a TV leaders debate. Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. It's absolutely true. Because I got involved in the website, I kind of had to get into Twitter, and I try to follow both sides. So you kind of see what's going on. There's this incredible reinforcement that goes on across social media of a certain view of the world, all right? And certainly, therefore, it undoubtedly helps to galvanize people. It's a way of, therefore, people be able to reinforce each other without having to have face-to-face social interaction. All of that's true. It's a device for reducing the cost of organisation. So if I were a yes supporter, I'd get my phone, put it on, find the app, the yes side app, and they tell me where to go out canvassing. All of that is true. And I think Mark would argue, and obviously there's a bit of a controversy going on about a certain increasingly infamous paper coming out of Glasgow Uni, but certainly I think Mark will say, well, actually, certainly at those points in the referendum when the yes side was making progress in the polls, there was also a spike in yes side activity in social media. But of course, which is cause and which is effect, is another matter. So, it's there, you can't ignore it, but there is, of course, a real danger with it for social scientists. The danger of it for social scientists is because it's there and it's free and it's easily mined, we look at it, all right? But actually, one of the things that, again, was also true, and coming back to the question, another thing that people were constantly being asked in the referendum is, have you talked face-to-face to somebody about the referendum? And you get 60% of people saying they'd spoken to somebody. So face-to-face interaction was still much more widespread than social media. And indeed, some of the, my phone kept on ringing for journalists, saying, particularly foreign journalists, because, they know that academics are nice to them and nobody else is. And they kind of say, And they come, they come from Spain or Greece or Italy, and they say, where is this referendum campaign? I cannot see it. Where is it? And I would say to them, just go down to the nearest pub or the nearest cafe, keep your ears open, and I bet you within half an hour you hear somebody talking about the referendum campaign. Because the truth is there was an incredible degree of face-to-face interaction going on. Now, we don't have a record of that because we didn't have a bunch of, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe there are some social psychologists out there who were out there taping what was going on in a pub. But in the absence of that material, we've got what's on social media, so we kind of fixate on it. But actually, the face-to-face, common, everyday social interaction was arguably the most remarkable thing about the referendum. Just an awful lot of people in this country were talking about politics in a way they wouldn't normally do so.
Well, I don't have any evidence. All I can say is about the week before the referendum, I went and got my hair cut, which you might be asking, why do I need to have my hair cut? My hairdresser, who I've never normally spoken to, then launched into this long conversation. And I think for many people, actually, the excitement was, it was genuinely a national conversation, and it did make politics something that people talked about. I think that's one reason why people feel relatively positive. But John, we will invite you back after next referendum to explain the basis of the yes vote. In the meantime, I'm sure there are many, many more questions and points that people want to raise. I know that I'm going to call you. And thank you very much for such a fascinating talk. As I say, if people want to continue looking, there are the resources there. What Scotland thinks, I have used myself many times. It not only has exhaustive polling evidence, it also has a large number of very interesting blogs, which takes us back to social media. And it's been a great pleasure to have you here, John, and let the conversation continue over wine and very high quality crisps. This is Thank you very much.